The silence of the Imperial archive in Ravenna was a peculiar thing. It was not the silence of peace, but the silence of neglect, heavy with the scent of decaying papyrus and the fine gray dust of centuries. Cassian Ambrosius Magnus, a man whose own dark hair was prematurely streaked with silver at the temples, moved through the towering rows of scrolls with a familiar, weary precision. Each footfall on the mosaic floor, depicting a faded scene of tritons and nereids, seemed to echo the fading grandeur of the Western Roman Empire itself. It was the year of the Incarnation 472, a reckoning that still felt alien to him, a scholar more attuned to the names of consuls long dead. The city outside, once the marsh-ringed haven of emperors, now hummed with a discordant energy, the capital of a realm that felt more like a phantom limb, twitching with the memory of power. Ricimer, the Suebian Magister Militum, the true master of Italy, had just elevated another puppet to the purple, Olybrius. Cassian had heard the news that morning, delivered with a shrug by a clerk more concerned with the price of bread than the name of the latest Augustus. What did it signify, another brief shadow on the throne before the next inevitable betrayal, the next barbarian general asserting his will? His own anxieties, as always, gravitated towards the more fragile inhabitants of this city, the words, the ideas, the accumulated wisdom of generations, penned on brittle papyrus and precious parchment. He paused before a shadowed alcove, his gaze resting on a particular set of unassuming scroll cases. Collections Varii Philosophorum Graecorum et Latinorum, the Stoics. His intellectual kinsmen. What would become of them in this endless, brutal shuffle of power? The thought, a familiar stone in his gut, tightened its cold grip. His own life was a testament to this slow, grinding erosion. The Ambrosii, his senatorial family, had once commanded vast estates across Emilia and Liguria. Now, like the empire itself, their holdings were diminished, nibbled away by exorbitant taxes, by the insatiable demands of a state perpetually at war with shadows, or with its own supposed guardians. His education, a luminous period spent in the lecture halls of Rome and the shaded groves of Athens, now seemed like a dream from a distant, more coherent epoch. He remembered walking the paths of the academy, the air still seeming to vibrate with the lost dialogues of Plato. It was a world away from Ravenna, where the dominant philosophy was increasingly that of the sword and the bulging purse. The memory of his younger brother, Lucius, was a constant, dull ache. Lucius, a tribune of fierce intelligence and even fiercer loyalty, had not fallen in glorious battle against a worthy foe. No, he had been a victim of the squalid machinations of a jealous superior, a casualty of the petty corruption that gnawed at the heart of the Roman military. Lucius, who could recite Virgil with a soldier's fervor, whose favorite line from the Aeneid was, Tu ne sed malus, sed contra denturido. Yield not to evils, but go forth all the more boldly against them. Cassian, in his quiet, scholarly fashion, tried to honor that injunction. His own battlefield was here, amongst the decaying texts. His weapons a soft brush and the meticulous care of a cataloguer. His official position, a minor curatorship granted through some forgotten family connection, was a sinecure, a dusty corner of the vast, crumbling edifice where he could at least bear witness. A silent guardian of fading voices. A sharp, decisive rap on the heavy oak door of the archive startled him from his reverie. Visitors were rare, intrusions into his carefully ordered desolation. He unlatched the door to reveal Livia. Her dark, intelligent eyes, the color of ripe olives, took in the cavernous space with a swift, appraising glance. She was a woman who moved through Ravenna's treacherous social and economic landscape with a pragmatism that Cassian found both admirable and somewhat unsettling. Widowed when her husband, a decurion of the city guard, had been killed in a skirmish with Alemannic raiders. Years ago, Livia had transformed her modest inheritance and considerable wits into a surprisingly robust trading network. She dealt in necessities, grain when it could be sourced, local wine, olive oil, occasionally even scarce iron implements. Her true currency, Cashin knew, was information and connections. Cashin, she stated, her voice low and direct, bypassing any customary greeting as she stepped past him into the archive. Still conversing with the departed. A faint smile touched Cashin's lips. They often offer more stimulating company than the living, Livia. He gestured towards a worn wooden stool, an invitation she ignored. What brings you to this mausoleum of forgotten edicts? Parchment, she replied, her gaze sweeping over the towering shelves, each crammed with scrolls in various states of preservation. Good quality, if such a thing can still be found in this city. And ink. The deepest black you can locate. I have a sensitive agreement to be drafted. She paused, a slight, almost imperceptible tightening around her mouth. With certain individuals who, shall we say, appreciate the appearance of Roman legal formality, even if the finer points of jurisprudence escape them. Cashin understood. She meant some of the Gothic federati captains, men whose loyalty was as shifting as the marsh mists around Ravenna, men who were increasingly the de facto arbiters of power and dispute resolution, often preferring their own tribal customs but occasionally finding a veneer of Roman law useful for asserting legitimacy or intimidating rivals. Parchment of quality is dearer than Syrian silk these days, Livia. And true lampblack ink, properly prepared. That requires resources even the Imperial scribes struggle to command. Livia gave him a look that conveyed she was well aware of the archive's nominal, if poorly supplied, access to such materials. But you, Cashin, know the keepers of such things. Or at least, you know how to navigate the labyrinthine ways of this palace to find them. Her eyes flickered towards the scroll cases he had been contemplating earlier. And you, in turn, might one day require a service from me. A discreet word in the right ear. A message conveyed through channels unavailable to a scholar, perhaps even a secure, temporary home for some of your more vulnerable literary companions. Cashin felt a subtle shift in the air, the faintest stirring of a possibility he had scarcely dared to articulate even to himself. Livia was offering more than a simple transaction. She was offering an alliance, a thread of pragmatic aid in a world where such things were becoming as rare as unadulterated wine. He thought of his Stoics, of their fragile wisdom. I will make inquiries, he said slowly, the words carefully chosen. There is an old chandler, Eusebius, by the workshops near the Basilica Urgiana. His son was a scribe in the prefect's office. Before the Goths found more pressing uses for his talents as a quartermaster's clerk. Eusebius might still possess a small, hoarded supply. Livia nodded, a brief, decisive gesture. My gratitude will be commensurate with the quality of the materials, Cashin. She paused at the threshold, the weak sunlight from the corridor limning her practical, unadorned figure. A word of caution, scholar. The whispers from the port suggest that Julius Nepos, our current Dalmatian Augustus, sits uneasily on his throne. Constantinople grows weary of his demands for gold and troops he cannot effectively command, and when emperors become inconvenient. She let the implication hang in the air, a chilling reminder of the precariousness that defined their lives. Cashin was left in the echoing silence, the dust motes dancing in the pale light. The barbarians, he reflected, were no longer merely at the gates. They were within the city. Within the government, their influence a palpable force. And with every shift in the delicate, brutal balance of power, his scrolls, his repository of Rome's intellectual soul, became more imperiled. The need for more than just curatorial vigilance was becoming undeniably, frighteningly clear. The ensuing years unfolded like a poorly staged tragedy, a succession of emperors appearing and vanishing with bewildering speed. Glycerius, the choice of the Burgundian king Gundobad. was a fleeting shadow. Julius Nepos, the Eastern Emperor Zeno's candidate, managed to cling to power in Ravenna for a tense, anxious period, his authority a fragile thing that rarely extended beyond the city's formidable marshland defenses. Cassian observed this grim spectacle from the relative quiet of his archive, a detached chronicler of the empire's protracted death throes. He succeeded in procuring the parchment and ink Livia had requested. Old Eusebius, the chandler, his eyes clouded with a grief that had never truly lifted since his son's demotion, had indeed kept a small, precious cache. The quality was surprisingly fine. Saved, Cassian suspected, for some special occasion that would now never come. Eusebius' gratitude for Cassian's simple act of remembering his son's former skills. For speaking his name with respect, was a poignant reminder of the human cost of the era's ceaseless upheavals. Livia, in return, proved a valuable, if unconventional, ally. Her network of informants, woven through the city's markets, docks, and even into the households of some of the Federate commanders, occasionally brought Cassian useful tidbits of news, or a rare luxury, a small amphora of genuine Falernian wine, a handful of dried figs from Syria, small tokens of an interconnected world that was rapidly fragmenting. These gestures, Cassian knew, were not mere kindness. They were Livia cementing their alliance, ensuring his continued, if minor, usefulness to her. He, in turn, would sometimes help her decipher a complex Latin contract or offer an opinion on the historical precedent for some obscure property dispute, skills that Livia, for all her street wisdom, lacked. Then, in the oppressive heat of the summer of 475, the political landscape of Italy tilted violently. Flavius Orestes, the Pannonian patrician, a man of considerable ambition and shifting allegiances, he had once served as notarius to Attila the Hun himself before adroitly navigating the treacherous currents of Roman military service, made his decisive move. Marching on Ravenna with a force of loyal Germanic troops, Orestes found the city's gates open to him with little resistance. Julius Nepos, his support dissolving like sea mist, fled across the Adriatic to Salona in Dalmatia, there to reign as a diminished emperor in exile, a king of memories. Orestes, now the undisputed magister militum and the effective ruler of Italy, chose, with a characteristic blend of Roman tradition and barbarian pragmatism, not to claim the imperial purple for himself. Instead, after a few months of consolidating his power, he orchestrated the elevation of his own son. The change in Ravenna's atmosphere was palpable. Orestes, a man of action accustomed to the brutal efficiencies of military command, had little patience for what he perceived as the cumbersome, often corrupt, machinery of the old civil administration. Edicts and proclamations began to issue from the Palladium with unsettling frequency, each one seemingly designed to strip away another layer of the city's fading Romanitas. One such edict, delivered to Cassian by a supercilious clerk from Orestes' newly established scrinium, struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was titled, with a chilling bureaucratic neutrality, De Requisition et Consolidamento Scriptorum Publicorum, concerning the requisition and consolidation of public writings, to ensure the efficient use of resources and eliminate redundancies. Various minor archives, prefectural libraries, and temple scriptoria were to be merged. Ancient administrative records, outdated tax rolls, local senatorial decrees, and, the phrase that made Cassian's blood run cold, volumina philosophica pagana usus hodierni limitati, pagan philosophical scrolls of limited contemporary use, were to be gathered and assessed. The most valuable, the edict stated, might be transferred to the main Palatine library, which was itself in a state of considerable disarray. The rest, Cassian knew with sickening certainty, would likely be consigned to the damp lower vaults of the Basilica Herculia. Used as tinder for the public baths, or, the ultimate sacrilege, scraped clean by Orestes' scribes to provide fresh parchment for the endless stream of military payrolls and troop movement orders. His heart hammered against his ribs as his eyes scanned the preliminary inventory list attached to the edict. It was a catalogue of Rome's intellectual heritage, carelessly compiled, riddled with misspellings and ignorant classifications. And there, halfway down the third page, nestled between a register of grain shipments from Apulia from the reign of Honorius and a collection of panegyrics to forgotten usurpers, was the entry that stopped his breath. Collections varii philosophorum Graecorum et Latinorum, ex bibliotheca Ulpia Olum translati, status conservandi insertus. Various collections of Greek and Latin philosophers, formerly transferred from the Ulpian library, conservation status uncertain. His Stoics. His beloved Seneca, whose letters on resilience and virtue had been a private solace through so many dark years. Epictetus, whose Enchiridion he knew almost by heart. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, speaking across the centuries in the clear, precise Greek of his meditations, unique commentaries, irreplaceable recensions, the very sinews of Roman reason and ethical thought. Conservation status uncertain was a death sentence. A cold, sharp panic, unfamiliar and unwelcome, pierced through Cassian's customary scholarly detachment. This was no longer a generalized anxiety about the slow decay of learning. This was an imminent, specific threat to the very soul of that learning. These were not merely dusty scrolls. They were living voices, the distilled essence of centuries of human striving for wisdom and virtue. To allow them to be lost, to be casually obliterated by the pragmatic necessities of a Pannonian warlord, felt like a betrayal of everything he held sacred, a betrayal of his brother Lucius's memory. A betrayal of Rome itself. His first, desperate impulse was the one most familiar to him, the formal, reasoned appeal. He spent a sleepless night drafting a petition to the new Magister Officiorum, a grim-faced former legionary commander named Pelagius. One of Orestes's most trusted, and feared, lieutenants. Cassian wrote with an eloquence born of desperation, detailing the unique historical and philosophical value of the targeted texts. Their irreplaceability, their profound significance for understanding the very foundations of Roman civilization. He emphasized their fragile condition not as a liability, but as a compelling reason for special care and dedicated preservation, not for careless destruction. He argued that true Roman strength lay not merely in its legions, but in the enduring power of its ideas. He waited for days, each sunrise bringing a fresh wave of anxiety, his meticulously ordered world now teetering on the brink of an abyss. The reply, when it finally arrived, was not even a formal letter, but a brusque annotation scribbled in crude military Latin at the bottom of his own carefully penned petition. The ink a belligerent purple, necessitates militas precedent. Magister militum spatio et rebus eget. Curi tui notati sunt sed secondarii habenter. Military necessities take precedence. The master of soldiers requires space and materials. Your concerns are noted but deemed secondary. Secondary. The accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years, the intellectual heritage that had once illuminated the known world, dismissed as secondary. Despair, cold and cloying, threatened to suffocate him. He paced the silent, dusty aisles of his archive, the neat rows of scrolls now seeming like mourners at a funeral. What could one man, armed only with a scholar's reverence and a trembling hand, possibly do against the iron will of a general who commanded the remnants of Rome's armies and the fierce loyalty of barbarian federates? He thought of Livia, her sharp eyes, her pragmatic resourcefulness, her network that extended into the city's hidden crevices. It was a fragile, desperate hope, but in a world rapidly running out of options, it was the only one he possessed. He found Livia in the bustling, cacophonous marketplace near the Basilica Urgiana, a vibrant, chaotic island in the otherwise subdued city. She was overseeing the unloading of sacks of salt from a river barge that had, against considerable odds, made its way up from the coastal salt pans near Comacchio. Salt, in these uncertain times, was as good as silver. Her dark hair was efficiently tied back. Her tunic practical, her expression one of intense concentration as she argued with a surly boatman over the tally. Cassian waited, a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest, until her transaction was concluded. When she finally turned to him, her eyes narrowed slightly at his unusually agitated demeanor. Cassian. You look as though you have seen a ghost. Worse, Livia, he said, his voice low and urgent. I have seen the future, and it is one of ashes and ignorance. He quickly, passionately, explained Orestes' edict, the targeted collection of philosophical texts, the dismissive reply from Pelagius. Livia listened without interruption, her gaze sharp and appraising. When he had finished, her initial response was a dry, almost cynical remark. So, the great Orestes now wages war on dead philosophers. And you expect me, Cassian, a humble merchant woman trying to keep body and soul together in this collapsing charnel house, to risk what little I have for a pile of decaying papyrus that preaches contentment with crusts while Ravenna starves. The words, though harsh, were not entirely unexpected. Cassian flinched but held his ground. It is more than that, Livia. Infinitely more. These are not just dead philosophers. They are the very architects of Roman reason, the voices that taught us justice, fortitude, wisdom. If we allow these thoughts to be extinguished, if men forget how to think critically, how to govern themselves with reason, how to live with virtue, then what is left of Rome? What will remain but brute force and superstition? His voice, usually so measured, trembled with a rare intensity. Livia studied his face, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. Perhaps she saw beyond the desperate scholar to the core of unyielding conviction. Perhaps she remembered her own late husband, a man of simple education but innate decency, lost to the senseless violence that now seemed to define their age. Perhaps she simply saw an opportunity. A debt to be incurred that might one day be repaid in a form she valued. The risks are enormous, Cassian, she said, her tone now more serious. Orestes is not a man known for his leniency towards those who defy his direct orders, especially not for something he would undoubtedly consider treasonous sentimentality. She paused. If we are caught. I know, Cassian acknowledged, his voice barely a whisper. The consequences were dire, confiscation of his own meager property, imprisonment, possibly even execution as an example to others who might cling too fiercely to the past. But I cannot. I will not stand idly by and watch them burn, or be scraped clean to record how many modii of barley are owed to some Gothic chieftain. Livia let out a long, slow breath, a gusty sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the city's weariness. Very well, scholar, she said at last, a wry, almost reluctant smile touching her lips. For the sake of your unfortunate brother's memory, then. And because you once managed to find me parchment fine enough to impress a bishop. But understand this, Cassian, you will owe me. You will owe me greatly. And if this venture turns sour, if Orestes' hounds get wind of it, I will deny ever having laid eyes on you. Is that clear? A wave of relief, so profound it almost buckled his knees, washed over Cassian. It was a harsh bargain, but an honest one. Perfectly clear, Livia. And my gratitude. It will be as boundless as the folly of our current rulers. Save your elegant phrases for your precious scrolls, she retorted, though not unkindly. Her mind was already racing, calculating angles, assessing risks. We will need a plan. A meticulously crafted plan. And strong, discreet hands. Those chests of wisdom, I imagine, are heavier than they appear. Their initial operations were fraught with a tension that gnawed at Cassian's nerves. Livia, through her intricate network of informants, a disgruntled clerk in Pelagius' office, a watchman at the Palatine archive with a weakness for Livia's watered wine, a dockworker who owed her a significant favor, identified periods when the archive where the condemned texts were being temporarily consolidated was either understaffed or its guards lax and distracted. Under the cloak of Ravenna's damp, misty nights, Cassian, his heart pounding like a siege drum, would slip into the archive. His intimate knowledge of its labyrinthine corridors, a product of years spent in its dusty embrace, now proved invaluable. He would locate the specific chests containing his targeted scrolls, his fingers tracing the faded inscriptions with a mixture of reverence and urgency. Then, Livia's chosen operatives, usually a pair of burly Istrian boatmen named Titus and Gisco, men of few words and unquestionable loyalty to her, would materialize from the shadows. The chests, sometimes disguised as sacks of refuse or legitimate consignments of state supplies being moved under official seal, a seal Livia had somehow managed to borrow, would be spirited away. Each successful extraction felt like a desperate gamble won, a small, defiant victory against the encroaching tide of barbarism and ignorance. The scrolls were transported to a disused, half-flooded cellar beneath a warehouse Livia controlled near the city's main canal, the Canale Candiano, which connected Ravenna to the port of Class. The conditions were far from ideal, the air was heavy with the smell of stagnant water and mildew, but it was marginally better, Cassian prayed, than the fate Orestes' edict had ordained. He would spend anxious hours there, checking the seals on the scroll cases, whispering reassurances to the silent, fragile voices within. During this period of heightened anxiety and clandestine activity, Cassian found himself increasingly contemplating another potential, if equally improbable, avenue of salvation. He had heard whispers in the Christian quarter of a small, relatively new monastery established a few miles south of Ravenna, nestled in a quiet grove of ancient pines near the Via Papilia, the road leading to Class. Its abbot, a man named Valerius, was reputed to be not only a devout man of God but also surprisingly learned, possessing a quiet respect for classical letters, seeing in them not merely pagan error but echoes of a divine truth that transcended formal religious boundaries. The idea of entrusting the Stoics and Platonists, the very pillars of Roman pagan thought, to a Christian monastic community felt like a profound paradox, a desperate irony. Yet, where else was there to turn? The imperial administration was actively hostile. The private libraries of the remaining Roman nobility were being broken up, their owners either fleeing Italy, succumbing to the new political realities, or simply lacking the will or resources for such preservation. The thought of Valerius's monastery, however remote the possibility, began to take root in Cassian's mind as a potential sanctuary, a last, desperate hope for the voices he was trying to save. One bleak, drizzly morning in late autumn, using the pretext of seeking a specific hagiography of Saint Apollinaris, Ravenna's patron, for the Imperial Library's dwindling Christian collection, a request so innocuous it would arouse no suspicion, Cassian made the journey south. The road to Class was rutted and poorly maintained, a stark contrast to the once immaculate Roman highways. He passed abandoned farmsteads, their fields fallow, and nervous groups of travelers who eyed him with suspicion. The very landscape seemed to reflect the empire's decay. The monastery of St. Stephen, when he finally reached it, was a surprisingly humble affair. A collection of simple, sturdy wooden buildings, a small chapel, a refectory, a dormitory, and a few outbuildings for workshops and storage, all enclosed by a newly erected but formidable wooden palisade. Smoke curled from a chimney, carrying the scent of baking bread, a homely, reassuring aroma in the damp air. Brother Valerius received him not in a grand abbatial chamber, but in a small, sparsely furnished room that clearly served as the monastery's nascent scriptorium. A single long trestle table, a few stools, and shelves holding a modest but neatly arranged collection of codices and scrolls lined the whitewashed walls. Valerius himself was a man perhaps in his early 50s, his face etched with lines of thought and prayer, but his eyes, a clear, calm gray, held a deep, unwavering light. His welcome was simple, his Latin as pure and elegant as any Cassian had heard in the academies of Athens. Cassian, initially intending only to make a cautious inquiry, found himself, under the gentle prompting of Valerius's intelligent questions, speaking more openly than he had in years. He spoke of his fears for the classical texts, of the Edict of Orestes, of the irreplaceable wisdom threatened with oblivion. He spoke of Virgil's depiction of duty and fate, of Seneca's counsels on resilience, of Cicero's passionate defense of the Republic, of Marcus Aurelius's profound introspections. He did not hide his own philosophical leanings, nor his despair at the prevailing tide of ignorance. Valerius listened with an attentive patience, that Cassian found deeply soothing. He nodded occasionally, his hands, gnarled from labor but clearly capable of delicate work, clasped in the wide sleeves of his coarse brown Benedictine habit. When Cassian finally fell silent, his voice hoarse with emotion, the abbot remained quiet for a long moment, the only sound the gentle patter of rain on the wooden roof. The Logos, the divine word of God, is indeed our ultimate truth. Dominus Cassian, Valerius said at last, his voice gentle but firm. It illuminates all else. Yet, as the blessed Augustine himself discovered and taught, truth can have many antecedents. Many foreshadowings, even in the writings of those who did not know Christ. Did not St. Paul himself quote the pagan poets on the Areopagus, and our own Jerome? For all his ascetic zeal, could never truly forsake his beloved Cicero. A faint, compassionate smile touched Valerius's lips. Wisdom, wherever it may be found, if it leads towards virtue, towards understanding, towards the good, can be a handmaiden to faith. We too, here in our humble community, seek to preserve what is true and good. We copy the Holy Gospels, the letters of the Apostles, the commentaries of the Church Fathers. But a good scribe, Dominus, needs constant practice to maintain his skill, and a keen mind, even one devoted to God, thrives on the nourishment of noble thoughts, from whatever source they may spring, provided they are not contrary to divine law. He gestured towards a freshly copied manuscript of the Psalms, its black uncial script stark and beautiful against the creamy parchment. This is a noble, if perilous, endeavor you have undertaken, this guardianship of the ancient voices, but a damp cellar near the port, as you describe it. It is no sanctuary for such treasures. The mildew, the rats, the rising damp from the canals. These are but slow destroyers. The tides of men, their greed, their ignorance, their sudden destructive rages. These are far more swift, far more absolute. Cassian felt a surge of hope, so intense it was almost painful. You mean? You would consider. Valerius met his gaze directly, his calm gray eyes unwavering. Our community is small, Dominus Cassian, and our resources are meager, dependent on the charity of the faithful and the labor of our own hands. But our walls, with God's grace, are strong, and our purpose is clear. Should you ever find your current arrangements for these venerable texts untenable, then perhaps some of them might find a safer, drier home here. And a scholar of your evident learning and devotion, willing to share his knowledge, perhaps even to guide the hands of our younger brethren in the art of transcription. Such a man would be a most welcome guest, a gift from Providence. The offer, so unexpected in its generosity and understanding, hung in the air, potent and transformative. Cassian was deeply moved, but also acutely aware of the complexities. To entrust these foundational texts of Roman pagan philosophy, these symbols of a pre-Christian intellectual tradition, to the keeping of a Christian monastery, it was an irony that would not have been lost on Seneca or Pliny. Yet, where else was there, the imperial state was actively dismantling its own heritage. The private libraries of the senatorial class were being scattered to the winds. Their owners fleeing Italy or sinking into an impoverished apathy. I am overwhelmed by your offer, Brother Valerius, Cassion managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. The implications. The responsibilities. I must consider this. Deeply. Indeed, Valerius replied with a gentle nod. Prudence is a virtue in all great undertakings. Pray on it, Dominus. Meditate upon it. The Lord often provides refuge in the most unexpected of arcs. As Cassion made his way back to Ravenna later that day, the rain had stopped, and a watery afternoon sun was attempting to break through the clouds. The grey sky seemed a little less leaden, the air a little less oppressive. A path had opened. A fragile, improbable lifeline for his cherished scrolls, and perhaps, for some small part of his own weary soul. The alliance with Livia was one of pragmatic necessity. A compact forged in shared risk and mutual, if wary, respect. This potential new alliance with Valerius was something different, a covenant of shared intellectual purpose, a joining of hands across the seemingly vast divide of belief, united by a common reverence for the enduring power of the written word. Meanwhile, the political charade in Ravenna lurched towards its next act. In late August of 475, Orestes, having effectively neutralized any potential rivals and secured the loyalty of the key Germanic contingents within the army of Italy, finally made his long-anticipated move. He orchestrated a carefully staged military parade through the streets of Ravenna, culminating in the elevation of his own young son, Romulus, to the imperial dignity. Romulus, a boy of perhaps 14, his face pale and bewildered beneath the heavy weight of the jeweled diadem, was proclaimed Augustus. Romulus Augustulus, the little emperor, the name that would echo with such bitter irony through the annals of history, was now the titular ruler of the dying Western Roman Empire. Cassion watched the procession from a discreet distance, his heart heavy with a sense of foreboding. The symbolism was almost too cruel, too blatant, a child emperor for a senile, decaying empire. The cheering crowds were sparse, their acclamations thin and unconvincing, a far cry from the thundering ovations that had once greeted triumphant Caesars. This was not a new beginning. It was, he felt with a chilling certainty, merely another scene in the final act. The elevation of Romulus Augustulus, as Cassion had feared, did nothing to alleviate the fundamental crises gripping Italy. The treasury remained empty, the bureaucracy inefficient and corrupt. The army restive and demanding. Orestes, ruling as patrician and the power behind his son's fragile throne, found himself increasingly isolated. His refusal to grant the demands of his foederati, the Herulian, Syrian, and Ruggian mercenary troops who formed the backbone of his military strength, for 1/3 of the lands in Italy, a concession long granted to similar groups in Gaul and Spain, proved to be a fatal miscalculation. These were hardened warriors. Men who had fought Rome's battles for generations, propped up its emperors, and defended its shrinking frontiers. They felt betrayed, their loyalty taken for granted. In the late summer of 476, their simmering discontent boiled over. The Federate troops, in a series of tumultuous assemblies, renounced their allegiance to Orestes and proclaimed as their leader one of their own, a charismatic and ambitious Syrian officer named Odoacer. Odoacer, a man who had served in the imperial bodyguard of Ricimer, who knew the treacherous corridors of the Palladium in Ravenna and the profound weaknesses of its defenders, now became the champion of the disgruntled barbarian soldiers. He promised them the lands Orestes had denied. Orestes, taking the young Romulus Augustulus with him, retreated from Ravenna to the more easily defended city of Ticinum Pavia, desperately hoping to rally support from the remaining Roman garrisons or loyal landowners. It was a futile gesture. Odoacer, his forces swelling with defectors, pursued him relentlessly. Ticinum fell after a brief siege. Orestes was captured and, on Odoacer's orders, executed at Placentia on the 28th of August. The news of Orestes' death reached Ravenna like a thunderclap, sending shockwaves of fear and uncertainty through the city. The patrician, the strong man who had ruled Italy for a year, was gone. The child emperor's fate, and Ravenna's, hung precariously in the balance. For Cassian, Livia, and brother Valerius, the escalating crisis was both a moment of extreme peril and a window of desperate opportunity. With Orestes dead and Odoacer's main forces still consolidating their victory around Ticinum and preparing their march on Ravenna, the capital was in a state of administrative paralysis and near anarchy. The city guard was demoralized, their loyalties divided. It was now or never to move the last, most precious consignment of scrolls from the precarious shelter of Livia's warehouse cellar to the relative, and hopefully more permanent, safety of Valerius's monastery. "We must move tonight," Cassian, Livia said, her voice taut with urgency, when they met in their usual discreet rendezvous point, a quiet, crumbling exedra in the old Forum Boreum, its faded mosaics depicting scenes of rustic prosperity from a long-vanished age. Her face was pale in the twilight, but her eyes were resolute. "Odoacer's vanguard will be at the city gates within days, if they are not already lurking in the marshes. Once his men take full control, Ravenna will be locked down tighter than a miser's purse. And who can say what orders he will issue concerning private property, concerning old things of no apparent military value?" Cassian nodded, his throat tight with a mixture of fear and grim determination. This was it. The culmination of months of anxious planning, of whispered conversations, of risks taken in the dead of night. The final, desperate gamble for the preservation of the philosophical voices that had become his life's work. He had, with Livia's indispensable aid, managed to rescue a significant portion of the targeted collection, the unique recensions of Seneca's letters to Lucilius, the almost complete set of commentaries on Epictetus's discourses by Arrian that he believed existed nowhere else, a particularly beautiful, if tragically damaged, codex of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations in the original Greek, its papyrus fragile as a butterfly's wing. These were the crown jewels, the heart of the legacy he was determined to save. Brother Valerius, when Cassian had broached the desperate plan to him earlier that day, had readily agreed, his calm demeanor a steadying influence. He had arranged for a small, sturdy, covered cart, ostensibly to carry a late harvest of olives and a few amphorae of new wine from a sympathetic Christian farmer to the monastery for blessing and winter storage. Livia, using her carefully cultivated connections and a not inconsiderable bribe, had secured the grudging complicity of a gatekeeper at the Porta Caesarea, one of an older cohort of guards whose loyalty to any particular regime was far outweighed by his loyalty to his own purse. Their plan was to move the scrolls just after dusk, when the changing of the watch and the general confusion and fear gripping the city might provide enough cover for their clandestine operation. As twilight deepened, over Ravenna, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, the city seemed to hold its breath in an agony of suspense. Odoacer's main force, it was rumored, was now camped just a few miles outside the walls, his Herolian and Syrian scouts already a common, if unsettling, sight in the outlying districts. Emissaries from Odoacer were said to be within the Palladium, negotiating the terms of the city's surrender. There would be no heroic last stand. Ravenna, stripped of its defenders, knew it was beaten. The air in the narrow, shadowed lanes was thick with unspoken anxieties. With the distant, sporadic shouts of leaderless soldiers, and the increasingly frequent tramp of hobnailed boots as patrols, some still nominally loyal to the memory of Orestes or the absent Romulus Augustulus, others already surreptitiously declaring for Odoacer, moved through the streets with an unsettling mixture of nervousness and predatory anticipation. Cassian, Livia, and brother Valerius, accompanied by Livia's two ever-reliable Istrian boatmen, Titus and Gisco, met at the pre-arranged time in the cavernous, rat-infested cellar beneath Livia's warehouse. By the flickering light of a single oil lamp, They carefully loaded the last, most precious bundles of scrolls into the stout wooden chests Livia had procured. Each movement was precise, hushed, imbued with a sense of solemn urgency. The scrolls, many of them centuries old, wrapped in layers of oiled linen and packed carefully with dried herbs to ward off insects, felt impossibly heavy, freighted not just with their physical weight but with the accumulated weight of the centuries of thought they contained. Cashin's hands, usually so steady when handling the fragile papyrus of an ancient text, trembled as he secured the leather straps on the final chest. He paused for a moment, his fingers resting on the worn, smooth wood, whispering a silent prayer to whatever gods of wisdom and preservation might still be listening. They set off, the cart, its wheels carefully muffled with rags, creaking softly in the deepening gloom. Brother Valerius, his face a calm mask in the flickering lamplight that Titus carried, led the patient, plodding mule. Cashin and Livia walked close beside the cart, their senses straining for any sound, any movement that might signal danger. Titus and Gisco, their expressions grim and watchful, flanked them, their hands never far from the hilts of the short, practical knives concealed beneath their rough woolen cloaks. The streets of Ravenna were a disorienting labyrinth of fear and shadows. Some quarters were eerily silent, their inhabitants huddled behind barred doors. Others were unnervingly loud, filled with the drunken shouts of soldiers no longer bound by discipline, or the opportunistic cries of citizens already beginning to loot abandoned shops or the homes of those known to have been Orestes' supporters. Livia, her knowledge of Ravenna's hidden alleyways and forgotten passages proving invaluable, guided them on a winding, circuitous route, carefully avoiding the main thoroughfares where Odoacer's advance parties were rumored to be establishing checkpoints. They were perhaps halfway to their destination, the Porta Caesarea, which led out onto the southern road towards Class and Valerius's monastery. They were navigating a particularly narrow, shadowed lane, hemmed in by the high, windowless walls of what had once been a wealthy patrician domus, its gardens now overgrown, its mosaics crumbling. The air was stagnant, heavy with the smell of decay and fear. Suddenly, a harsh, guttural challenge shattered the oppressive silence. "State, cas et unde proficissimini, halt, who are you and from whence do you proceed?" A patrol of 5 Herulian soldiers, their faces rough-hewn and bearded in the dim light, their armor a motley collection of dented Roman cuirassas and scavenged Germanic mail, materialized from the deeper darkness at the end of the lane, effectively blocking their path. Their leader, a burly, thick-set man with a scar that jaggedly bisected one eyebrow and a predatory glint in his small, close-set eyes, stepped forward, his hand resting confidently on the hilt of his spada. Livia reacted with astonishing speed, her voice, when she spoke, surprisingly calm, betraying none of the sudden terror that had constricted Cashin's own throat. "Peace, good soldiers," she said, her Latin fluent but tinged with a faint mercantile lilt that often had the effect of disarming suspicion, making her seem like a harmless, practical woman of commerce. "We are but simple folk. I am Livia, a merchant of this city, merely delivering a small offering of grain and a little wine to the good brothers at the monastery of Saint Stephen, out on the Class road. A vow I made for the health of my ailing mother, you understand." She managed a strained, placatory smile. The leader, whose name Cashin would later learn was Hunulf, a man known in the barracks for his brute strength and equally brutish cunning, grunted, unconvinced. His eyes, like those of a carrion bird, flickered over the covered cart, lingering on the stout wooden chests. "Grain and wine, you say, woman, in such finely crafted chests." He prodded one of the chests with the scarred toe of his hobnailed boot. It made a dull, solid sound. "Looks more like treasure to me. Or perhaps weapons being smuggled to those who still resist the will of the noble Odoacer." He grinned, a humorless baring of teeth. "Open them. Let us see these pious offerings." Cashin's blood turned to ice in his veins. This was disaster. Brother Valerius, his face serene but his eyes watchful, placed a calming hand on Cassian's arm, a silent admonition against any rash action. "We carry only what this good woman says." "Brave soldier," the monk said, his voice even and resonant, carrying a quiet authority that momentarily seemed to give even Hunulf pause. "Simple provisions for our humble community. And perhaps, yes, a few blessed texts for our nightly prayers and contemplation. Nothing of value to men of war." Hunulf let out a short, harsh bark of laughter. "Blessed texts, we shall be the judge of that. Drusus," he called to one of his men, a younger, more eager-looking soldier with shifty eyes. "Pry open that largest chest. Let us see what manner of blessings these devout Romans are hiding from their new protectors." The soldier named Drusus stepped forward, a crude iron pry bar appearing in his hand as if by magic. Cassian felt a surge of desperate, impotent rage. These were not just texts. They were the living thoughts of sages, the very essence of the civilization he was so desperately trying to shield from. The encroaching darkness. To see them pawed at, defiled, perhaps destroyed by these ignorant brutes. Before he could utter the protest that was clawing at his throat, Livia moved again, with the swift, decisive grace of a cornered animal. Her hand delved into the leather pouch at her belt. "Perhaps," she said, her voice dropping to a more confidential, almost conspiratorial tone, addressing Hunulf directly. "A small token for your vigilance, noble captain, for ensuring the safe passage of honest folk through these troubled streets. The times are so perilous, and a man of your responsibilities must have many expenses." She discreetly, but not too discreetly, allowed Hunulf to catch the glint of a few silver soliqui in her palm. Hunulf's eyes, which had been fixed on the chest, narrowed, then flickered towards the proffered coins. Greed, a primal, uncomplicated emotion, warred visibly with his ingrained suspicion and his desire to assert his newfound authority. It was a delicate, precarious moment, the fate of centuries of wisdom hanging on the whim of a semi-literate barbarian soldier. He was about to speak, perhaps to accept the bribe, perhaps to demand more, when another figure emerged from the deeper shadows at the far end of the narrow lane. This newcomer was taller than Hunulf, with a more lean, wolfish build and a palpable air of menace. His armor, though no finer than that of Hunulf's men, was worn with a swaggering arrogance. This was Radagais, a rival captain within Odoacer's diverse federati forces, a Goth known for his ambition, his cruelty, and his particular animosity towards any who managed to prosper independently within Ravenna. Livia, with her resilient trading network that had often bypassed the protection rackets run by men like Radagais, had incurred his displeasure on more than one occasion. "Well, well, Hunulf," Radagais called out, his voice a low, dangerous drawl, laden with a sneering sarcasm that made Cassian's skin crawl. "Reduced to shaking down humble merchants and holy men in dark alleyways now, has the discipline of our great king Odoacer become so lax already, that his captains must resort to petty banditry." He sauntered closer, his eyes, cold and reptilian, lingering on Livia with open hostility, then fixing on the chests with a predatory interest. "What have we here? Provisions for monks, you say, or perhaps something of greater interest. Something that should, perhaps, be reported directly to the Lord Odoacer himself." Hunulf, clearly discomfited and angered by Radagais's unexpected appearance and taunting words, scowled. "This is a routine inspection, Radagais, as is my right and duty. Mind your own affairs, Goth, before you find yourself explaining your presence here to those who value loyalty over insolence." But the interruption, Cassian saw with a sinking heart, had broken Hunulf's momentum. The silver Livia had offered now seemed less appealing if accepting it meant appearing weak or corrupt before a known rival who might eagerly carry tales to Odoacer's inner circle. The situation had just become infinitely more complicated, infinitely more dangerous. Livia, however, ever quick to seize the slightest shift in the volatile dynamics of power, immediately adapted her strategy. Indeed, "Noble Captain Radagais," she said smoothly, her voice betraying no hint of her previous animosity towards him, "we are but humble servants of God and honest, if modest, commerce. My good friend here, the learned Dominus Cassian Ambrosius Magnus," she gestured towards Cassian, who tried to look both learned and entirely harmless, "is merely transporting some old family documents, matters of inheritance and genealogy, to the safety of the monastery for safekeeping during these uncertain times. Of no intrinsic value, I assure you, to anyone but himself and perhaps, in time, the moths." She gave Cassian a subtle, almost imperceptible nudge, a silent command to speak. This was Cassian's cue, his moment. He was no orator, no soldier trained in the art of intimidation or battlefield rhetoric. His courage was the quiet, stubborn courage of the scholar, born of deep conviction rather than physical prowess. But looking at Radagais' sneering, predatory face, at Hinault's brutish indecision, something within him, a core of long-suppressed indignation and desperate resolve, hardened. He thought, with a strange clarity, of his brother Lucius. Of his unwavering belief in the enduring power of Roman virtue. He thought of the voices in the scrolls behind him, the voices of Seneca, of Epictetus, of Marcus Aurelius, all of whom had faced their own dark times with fortitude and an unyielding commitment to reason. He stepped forward, his slight, scholarly frame appearing surprisingly erect, his voice, when he spoke, clearer and stronger than he had thought possible. "Captain Radagais," he began, his gaze meeting the Goth's cold eyes without flinching, "these are indeed, as this good woman has said, old writings. Family records, matters of local history, some philosophical reflections from generations past." He paused, choosing his next words with the care of a man diffusing a volatile piece of Greek fire. "They speak of justice, Captain. Of courage in the face of adversity. Of duty to one's community and to the principles of right conduct. Virtues. I believe, that even your great leader, King Odoacer, whom all Italy now looks to for guidance and order, would surely respect as he undertakes the monumental task of governing this ancient land." He then did something he had not planned, something that sprang from a wellspring of conviction deeper than conscious thought. He quoted, not in a challenging way, but with a quiet, reflective dignity, a line from Seneca he had been transcribing just days before. A line that seemed to resonate with the very air of this crumbling empire, "Non quia difficilia sunt non audimus, sed quia non audimus difficilia sunt." It is not because things are difficult that we do not dare, but because we do one not dare that they are difficult. He did not offer a translation, letting the sonorous cadence of the Latin, the echo of a language that had once commanded the known world, hang in the tense silence of the shadowed lane. Radagais stared at him, a flicker of surprise, quickly replaced by a sneer of contempt, in his pale eyes. "Empty words, scholar. The bleating of sheep awaiting the butcher. The only justice in this world, the only truth, comes from the point of a well-sharpened sword and the strength of the arm that wields it." He was about to give an order. Cassian was certain of it, an order to seize the cart, to arrest them all, when Brother Valerius spoke, his voice calm but carrying an unexpected resonance in the confined space. "And yet, Captain," the abbot said, his gaze serene but firm as it met Radagais's, "even the strongest sword arm, even the most powerful king, is guided by a thought. By a belief, by some form of wisdom, however imperfectly understood. For what is strength without purpose? What is power without a vision for its use? Wisdom, Captain, is a shield against folly, and understanding a fortress against chaos. The Lord Odoacer is renowned for his great strength, his military prowess. Surely, as he now takes upon himself the governance of this ancient and venerable land of Italy, he also aspires to be known as a man of burgeoning wisdom. A king who rules not merely by force, but by justice and foresight." It was a masterful stroke of diplomacy, Appealing not to Radagai's better nature, for Cashin doubted such a thing existed, but to his ambition and his awareness of Odoacer's own nascent attempts to project an image beyond that of a mere barbarian warlord. Odoacer, after all, had not claimed the imperial title for himself, but had sent the Western imperial regalia to Emperor Zeno in Constantinople, with the carefully crafted message that one emperor was sufficient for the entire Roman world, and that he, Odoacer, would rule Italy as Zeno's patrician, a Roman title, under Roman law. To openly defy sentiments that aligned with Odoacer's own delicate political maneuvering. To be seen as a mere indiscriminate looter in front of his own men and, more importantly, in front of Hunulf's rival Herolian contingent, might not play well if word of his actions reached Odoacer's ears. Radagais hesitated, his cruel mouth twisting in frustration. He was clearly torn between his desire to assert his dominance over Livia and Cashin, and his reluctance to risk censure from Odoacer. It was at that precise moment of precarious equilibrium that salvation, or at least an unexpected reprieve, arrived from an entirely unforeseen quarter. From the main thoroughfare at the end of the lane, the Via Argentaria, came the distinct, unmistakable sound of a larger, more organized detachment of troops marching with disciplined precision, their armor clanking rhythmically, a brazen horn blowing a series of crisp, authoritative notes. It was clearly one of Odoacer's elite units, perhaps even his personal Herolian guard, systematically securing the key sectors of the city center. A gruff, commanding voice, deeper and carrying more inherent authority than either Hunulf's or Radagai's, echoed from the street, "Captain Radagais, Captain Hunulf, your patrols are required to report to the Forum Augustus for new assignments. Cease this dawdling and proceed there without delay. The king expects order, not street brawls over trifles." Cashin recognized the voice, or at least the accent and tone. It was Thutis, one of Odoacer's most senior Herolian commanders, a veteran warrior known for his fierce loyalty to Odoacer, his brutal efficiency, and his absolute intolerance for any indiscipline or unauthorized actions among the Federate troops. Hunulf and Radagais exchanged uneasy, resentful glances. Lingering here, squabbling over a card of dubious value in a dark alley, could now be genuinely dangerous for them if Thutis took an interest. Odoacer was known to be a stern, even ruthless, disciplinarian with his own forces when it suited his political purposes. Radagais shot Cashin a look of pure, unadulterated venom, a promise of future retribution. He spat contemptuously on the cobblestones. Another time, scholar, he snarled under his breath, loud enough for Cashin to hear. This city is small, and my memory is long. He turned abruptly and, with his men, strode quickly, almost eagerly, towards the sound of Thutis's command. Hunulf, clearly relieved to avoid any further confrontation with Radagais or, more importantly, with Thutis, grumbled something in his own tongue, then, almost as an afterthought, pocketed the few silver coins Livia still held out. "Go on." Then, he muttered to Valerius, his earlier bluster gone. "Get your cart off these streets. And try to stay out of further trouble. The king does not wish for unnecessary disturbances among the Roman populace tonight." He motioned his own men to follow Radagais. And just like that, they were gone. The narrow lane, moments before a stage for a life-and-death drama, was suddenly empty, save for Cashin's small, shaken group. Cashin let out a breath he had not realized he would been holding, his knees suddenly feeling as fragile as ancient papyrus. Livia leaned against the cold, damp wall of the abandoned domus for a moment, her usual composure finally cracking just a little, a sheen of perspiration on her upper lip. Brother Valerius, his face still serene, made a silent, almost imperceptible sign of the cross. Titus and Gisco, who had stood throughout the confrontation with their hands gripping the hilts of their concealed knives, their bodies tensed like coiled springs, relaxed almost invisibly, the tension flowing out of them like water. That, Livia breathed, her voice a little shaky, was altogether too close for comfort. Indeed, Brother Valerius agreed, his voice calm but carrying a new note of gravity. The Lord, in his mysterious and often terrifying wisdom, provided an interruption when it was most needed. He looked at Cassian. And there was a newfound respect, almost an awe, in his gaze. Your words, Dominus Cassian. They possessed a power, a resonance, I had not anticipated. Perhaps there is more strength in the wisdom of your philosophers than even you suspect. Cassian could only nod, still too shaken to speak. He had spoken out, not with the polished rhetoric of a trained orator from the Senate House of old, but with the raw, unadorned conviction of a man defending the last precious vestiges of his crumbling world. And somehow, in the brutal cacophony of a collapsing empire, those quiet words, spoken in the language of that empire's former glory, coupled with Livia's pragmatic silver and the opportune, if entirely coincidental, arrival of Thudis's patrol, had been enough. They had bought them a few more precious moments. They hurried on, the little cart, with its priceless cargo, now seeming almost impossibly light. The Porta Caesarea, when they finally reached it, was a scene of controlled chaos. Odoacer's troops were much in evidence, but Livia's prior arrangements with the venal gatekeeper, reinforced perhaps by the news of Odoacer's firm grip on the city and his desire to avoid alienating the Roman population unnecessarily in these first crucial hours, held firm. A cursory glance at the cart, another clinking of coins into the gatekeeper's outstretched palm. And the heavy gates creaked open just enough for them to pass. Soon, they were outside Ravenna's formidable walls, on the ancient, rutted road leading south towards the pine grove where Valerius's small monastery, the Abbey of St. Stephen, promised sanctuary. The air, though still tinged with the smoke from countless cook fires and the underlying scent of fear and uncertainty that clung to Ravenna like a shroud, felt cleaner, fresher. Behind them, the city lay under the shadow of its new barbarian master. Ahead, lay a fragile, uncertain hope. The months that immediately followed Odoacer's assumption of power, he astutely avoided the title of emperor, instead styling himself patrician and king of Italy, ruling, at least nominally, under the distant authority of Emperor Zeno in Constantinople, to whom he had dutifully dispatched the western imperial regalia, were a period of uneasy, watchful transition. Ravenna, the city that had witnessed the final, sputtering gasps of Roman rule in the west, settled into a new, unfamiliar rhythm. It was a rhythm dictated by Gothic and Herolian military commanders, by the pragmatic necessities of a new regime attempting to consolidate its authority and reward its followers without entirely alienating the remaining Roman populace or provoking intervention from the still formidable Eastern Empire. The ghost of the Western Empire had, it seemed, finally been laid to rest. The last emperor, the boy Romulus Augustulus, had been permitted a comfortable, if obscure, retirement in a Campanian villa, a curiously anticlimactic end to a line that stretched back to Augustus himself. For Cassian Ambrosius Magnus, this profound political earthquake, this shifting of the tectonic plates of history, was but a distant, rumbling backdrop to the quiet, intense, and profoundly urgent work unfolding within the wooden palisade of Brother Valerius's monastery. Valerius, true to his word and the spirit of Christian charity and scholarly respect that Cassian found increasingly remarkable, had welcomed them with open arms. A sturdy outbuilding, previously used for storing olives and wine from the monastery's small, meticulously tended groves and vineyards, was quickly cleared and repurposed. With its thick stone walls and narrow, high-set windows, it was surprisingly defensible, and, more importantly to Cassian, relatively dry and secure. This humble structure, smelling faintly of old wine and new wood, became their scriptorium, their fortress against the encroaching darkness of ignorance. To Cassian, after the anxieties of Livia's damp cellar and the constant threat of discovery in Ravenna, it felt like a sanctuary, a palace of rescued thoughts. With the scrolls he and Livia had so perilously salvaged, a collection that, while tragically incomplete, still represented a significant portion of the philosophical works targeted by Orestes's Edict, and with Brother Valerius's own modest but growing collection of Christian texts and patristic writings, they began the monumental task. First, meticulous cataloging. Then careful cleaning of the fragile papyrus and parchment, and finally, the most crucial and labor-intensive work of all, transcription. Copying. Ensuring that these unique, irreplaceable voices would not be silenced forever by the decay of a single manuscript. Resources were achingly, terrifyingly scarce. Parchment, each sheet representing the carefully prepared skin of a sheep or goat, demanding hours of skilled labor to scrape, stretch, and smooth, was a treasure beyond price. Ink, painstakingly ground from lampblack or oak galls, then mixed with gum arabic and wine or vinegar, had to be prepared with a chemist's precision to ensure its longevity and clarity. Quills, fashioned from the flight feathers of geese, required constant sharpening with a penknife, a skill Cassian had to relearn, his fingers often clumsy and sore. Yet, under Brother Valerius's serene, patient guidance and Cassian's meticulous, almost obsessive scholarship, a small, dedicated team began to form. There were a few older monks. Men who had received some education in their youth before taking their vows, their hands still retaining a memory of the scribe's art. There were younger novices, some of them former farmhands or laborers, their hands calloused and more accustomed to the plough or the mason's trowel than the delicate dance of the quill on parchment, but eager to learn, their faces alight with a mixture of awe and concentration as Cassian or Valerius guided their first, awkward attempts to form the beautiful, complex shapes of the Latin uncial script, or the even more challenging ligatures of Greek. Cassian found a new, unexpected, and deeply satisfying rhythm to his days, a sense of purpose that had long been absent from his life in Ravenna's decaying archives. He would rise before dawn, the air cold and sharp with the scent of pine, to join the monks for their early morning prayers in the small, unadorned chapel. This was a concession to his hosts, a mark of respect for their community and their faith, though his own spiritual solace still derived more from the Stoic acceptance of Seneca or the Neoplatonic contemplation of Plotinus than from the Christian liturgy. Yet, he found a surprising comfort in the repetitive, melodic chanting of the Psalms, a sense of shared endeavor, of belonging to something larger than himself. That had been missing from his solitary scholarly existence. Then, after a frugal breakfast of coarse bread and watered wine, the long hours in the scriptorium would begin. He taught the younger monks the intricacies of the alphabet. The proper way to hold a quill to achieve the desired thick and thin strokes, the disciplined flow of script across the ruled lines of the parchment. He showed them how to prepare their materials, how to mix the ink to the correct consistency, how to rule the faint guidelines with a lead plummet, how to prepare a new codex for binding with stout wooden boards and leather thongs. He worked alongside them, his own hands, once stained only with the pale dust of ancient archives, now frequently smudged with the dense black of the ink or sticky with the fish glue used for mending torn papyrus. He reserved the most fragile or unique texts, those whose loss would be an irreparable wound to the body of knowledge, for his own painstaking transcription, the nearly complete set of Seneca's letters to Lucilius, their wisdom on living and dying with dignity speaking with such startling contemporary clarity across the intervening centuries. The commentaries on Epictetus's discourses by Arrian, a text he believed existed in no other surviving copy. The beautiful, if tragically damaged, Codex of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, which he was slowly, carefully transcribing from its original Greek into a new Latin version, to make its profound introspections accessible to a wider, Latin-speaking audience in the generations to come, should such an audience ever re-emerge. As he copied, the words of the ancient philosophers seemed to seep into his very being, their calm reason, their acceptance of fate, their emphasis on inner virtue. a potent balm to his often troubled spirit. He would frequently discuss difficult passages or complex philosophical concepts with Brother Valerius, who possessed a surprisingly nuanced understanding of classical thought. They found unexpected points of convergence between Stoic ethics and Christian morality, or debated the subtle influence of Plato's Timaeus on the early church. Fathers like Origen and Clement of Alexandria. These conversations, conducted in the quiet, focused atmosphere of the scriptorium, with the scratch of quills as their only accompaniment, were for Cassian a lifeline. A reaffirmation that the pursuit of wisdom, in whatever form, was a noble and necessary endeavor. Livia became an infrequent but always eagerly anticipated visitor to the monastery. She had, with her characteristic astuteness and adaptability, navigated the transition to Odoacer's regime. Her trading networks, though necessarily altered and perhaps somewhat diminished, persisted. She brought them news from Ravenna, of Odoacer's ongoing delicate negotiations with Emperor Zeno in Constantinople for official recognition of his rule in Italy. Of the uneasy, often resentful, coexistence between the remaining Roman populace and their new Germanic overlords. Of the continued, inexorable decay of the old imperial administrative structures, their functions increasingly being taken over by the church or by local strongmen. But Livia also brought more tangible, and often more welcome, gifts, a small keg of surprisingly good wine from a vineyard near Beneventum that had somehow survived the recent upheavals. A bolt of fine, smooth linen, perfect for straining ink or for making soft cloths to clean delicate manuscripts. Sometimes, a few precious sheets of imported Egyptian papyrus, a rare luxury she had acquired through some typically convoluted and undoubtedly profitable transaction. Still at it, then, Cassian, Livia asked one blustery late autumn afternoon, a few months after Odoacer had firmly established his rule. She stood at the entrance of the scriptorium. Her cloak flecked with rain, a basket covered with a damp cloth in her hands. She watched him for a moment, his head bent in concentration as he painstakingly traced a complex Greek ligature onto a fresh sheet of parchment. Around him, several monks were similarly engaged. The room filled with the quiet scratch of quills and the murmur of Latin being read aloud. Cassian looked up, a rare, genuine smile briefly illuminating his usually somber features. The lines of weariness around his eyes seemed a little less pronounced these days, replaced by a focused intensity. "They are not entirely dead, Livia," he replied, his voice quiet but firm. "Not as long as someone reads their words. Not as long as their thoughts can still ignite a spark of understanding, of recognition, in a living mind." He gestured with his chin towards a young novice, no more than 16, his brow furrowed in concentration as he diligently copied a passage from Cicero's De Amicitia, his lips moving silently as he sounded out the unfamiliar Latin phrases. "Young Marcus there. He came to us 6 months ago, an orphan from a village near Forum Cornelii. Barely able to read his own name beyond the letters of the Pater Noster. Now, he argues with me, with considerable passion, about the precise nuances of Cicero's use of the subjunctive. That, Livia, he said, a note of quiet triumph in his voice, is not death. That is a form of resurrection, a continuity." Livia was silent for a moment, her gaze, usually so sharp and assessing, uncharacteristically thoughtful. She looked from young Marcus, lost in his work, to the growing rows of newly copied codices and scrolls beginning to fill the simple wooden shelves that lined the scriptorium walls, a small but growing library of rescued wisdom. "Perhaps you are right, scholar," she said at last, her voice softer than he was accustomed to hearing from her. "Perhaps some things are indeed worth more than the prevailing price of grain in Ravenna's market." She stepped forward and placed the basket she carried on the end of Cassian's trestle table. "A small contribution to your resurrections." Cassian lifted the cloth. Inside, nestled on a bed of clean straw, were several well-inked sheepskins, already scraped and partially prepared for use as parchment, and a small, tightly sealed clay pot. "This is calamarium," Livia explained, tapping the pot. "The finest lampblack ink. From a Jewish merchant in class. He said it was the last of his Alexandrian supply." Cassian was deeply touched. Good quality parchment and reliable ink were the lifeblood of their enterprise, commodities more precious than gold in these straitened times. "Livia, this is an extraordinary gift. How can I possibly repay you?" She shrugged, a hint of her usual briskness returning. "Consider it an investment in a future I may not understand, but one you seem determined to build, one word at a time. Besides," a wry smile touched her lips, "the Jewish merchant owed me a considerable favor for facilitating the movement of certain goods past Odoacer's more officious tax collectors. So, in a way, you are merely benefiting from the complex webs of obligation that keep this crumbling world from collapsing entirely." She paused, her expression becoming more serious. "I came also to say farewell, Cassian." A pang of genuine regret struck Cassian. Livia, for all her worldly cynicism and her sometimes alarmingly pragmatic view of life, had become a vital link to the world outside the monastery's walls. An unlikely ally, almost a friend. "You are leaving Ravenna." "And Italy, I think," she replied, her gaze distant for a moment. "There are opportunities further south, in Sicily. Or perhaps even across the sea, in Africa Proconsularis. If the Vandals there are not too disruptive to honest trade. Odoacer is a strong ruler, for a barbarian. He has brought a measure of order. But this is his kingdom now, Cassian, not ours. The old ways are gone. I am a trader. I must follow the routes that are still open, the markets that still function, however precariously." She looked at him directly. "You have found your sanctuary here, your way to endure. I must seek mine elsewhere." She extended her hand, a gesture of unexpected formality between them. Cassian took it, her grip surprisingly strong, her palm calloused from a life of effort. "May your journeys be safe, Livia," he said sincerely. "And may your ventures prosper." "And may your scrolls outlive us all, scholar," she replied, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, respect, perhaps, or a touch of wistful understanding. Then, with a brief nod to Brother Valerius, who had entered the scriptorium quietly and was observing them with his usual serene expression, she turned and was gone, a whirlwind of practical energy vanishing back into the turbulent, uncertain world from which she had briefly emerged to touch their lives. Cassian stood for a long moment, the clay pot of precious Alexandrian ink cool in his hands. He thought of the vast, lost libraries of Alexandria and Rome, of the great Imperial Palatine Library in Constantinople which, he prayed, still stood as a beacon of learning in the East. He thought of the immense intellectual heritage of the Greco-Roman world, so much of it already lost to war, to fire, to neglect, to the slow, relentless attrition of time and ignorance. What they were doing here, in this small, obscure scriptorium in a half-forgotten corner of Italy, felt like such a tiny, insignificant effort in the face of such monumental loss. Yet, as he looked around the room, at the intent faces of the monks bent over their desks, at the growing collection of newly transcribed texts, Seneca and Cicero, Augustine and Jerome, Plato and the Gospels, all standing side by side on the shelves, a testament to the shared pursuit of wisdom across different traditions, he felt not despair, but a profound, almost peaceful sense of purpose. Each carefully formed letter, each painstakingly copied page, was an act of defiance against the encroaching darkness, a small ember cupped carefully against the winds of chaos. Brother Valerius came to stand beside him, his gaze following Cassian's. "She is a remarkable woman, that Livia," the abbot said quietly. "A survivor. And, in her own way, a benefactor to our work." "Indeed," Cassian agreed. He picked up a freshly sharpened quill. Well, brother, the Alexandrian ink will not spread itself. Shall we see if young Marcus has finally mastered the complexities of the ablative absolute in his Cicero? Valerius smiled, a deep, warm expression that lit up his ascetic face. I believe he was last heard muttering something about Caesar's use of it in the Gallic Wars. A most hopeful sign, do not you think? Cassian returned the smile, a genuine, unburdened smile that felt unfamiliar and welcome on his own lips. The legacy of Rome, he realized with a clarity that was almost a revelation, was not to be found in its crumbling forums or its silent, empty basilicas, not in the tarnished glory of its legions or the forgotten edicts of its long-dead emperors. Those were but the transient shells, the discarded husks of a power that had waxed and waned, subject to the relentless, unforgiving cycles of history. Its true, enduring legacy, the part of Rome that might, with care and dedication, prove immortal, lay here. It lay in these carefully copied words, in the profound thoughts and timeless wisdom they contained. It lay in the disciplined pursuit of knowledge, in the quiet dedication of human intellect to understanding the world and its place within it. It lay in the small, determined flame of learning, passed carefully from hand to hand, from generation to generation, a fragile beacon refusing to be extinguished by the surrounding darkness. And as he watched young Marcus, his brow furrowed in concentration, dip his newly trimmed quill into the pot of rich, black Alexandrian ink, Cassian Ambrosius Magnus, once a despairing scholar adrift in the ruins of a dying empire, felt a quiet, unshakable conviction. The work would continue. The embers would be tended, the voices would not be silenced. The years that followed were marked by a quiet, almost monastic rhythm, a stark contrast to the turbulent decades Cassian had endured in Ravenna. Under Odoacer's surprisingly stable, if firm, rule, Italy experienced a period of relative peace, a weary respite from the endless civil wars and barbarian incursions that had characterized the final century of the Western Empire. Odoacer, though a Herulaean by birth and a king to his Germanic followers, governed largely through the existing Roman administrative structures, employing Roman officials and, for the most part, respecting Roman law and custom. He even undertook repairs to some public buildings, including the Colosseum in Rome itself. For the small community at the Abbey of St. Stephen, this meant a precious interlude of security, a chance to pursue their vital work without the constant threat of disruption or persecution. The scriptorium, under the joint guidance of Cassian and brother Valerius, flourished. News of their work, carried by itinerant monks, by pilgrims, and even by the occasional curious merchant, spread slowly through the fragmented landscape of what had once been Roman Italy. Other small monastic communities, hearing of the texts being copied at St. Stephen's, sent requests for specific works, a copy of Augustine's City of God for a struggling bishopric in Campania, a primer on Latin grammar for a new monastery school in Liguria, even, to Cassian's quiet satisfaction, a transcription of Seneca's On Clemency for a thoughtful Gothic count in Noricum who sought to rule his newly acquired Roman subjects with a measure of justice. Young Marcus, the orphan boy, became Cassian's most promising pupil, his quick mind absorbing not only the mechanics of script and the nuances of Latin grammar but also the deeper philosophical currents of the texts he copied. He developed a particular fondness for Boethius, that other great Roman scholar attempting to bridge the classical and Christian worlds, whose own tragic end under an earlier barbarian king served as a poignant reminder of the fragility of their endeavor. Other young men, drawn by the reputation of the scriptorium or seeking refuge from the uncertainties of the secular world, joined the community, swelling the ranks of the scribes. Cassian, now well into his 50s, his hair almost entirely white, found a measure of contentment he had never thought possible. The deep melancholy that had once shadowed his days had not entirely vanished, the memory of Rome's lost grandeur, of his brother's untimely death, of the countless texts irretrievably lost to time and destruction, still brought moments of profound sadness. But this sorrow was now tempered by a quiet sense of purpose, by the tangible evidence of the legacy he was helping to build, one carefully lettered page at a time. He was no longer merely a custodian of the past, a passive archivist of decay. He was an active participant in its transmission, a conduit for its enduring wisdom. He still missed Livia's sharp wit and pragmatic presence. She had written to him once, a brief, typically unsentimental note from Sicily, where she had, as expected, established a thriving new trading concern, dealing in grain and African pottery. She had inquired, with a gruffness that Cassian knew masked genuine interest, if his dead philosophers were still behaving themselves. He had replied, through a traveling monk, that they were indeed, and were, in fact, making many new converts among the living. He never heard from her again, but he often thought of her. A small, indomitable spark of Roman resilience out in the wider, wilder world. One crisp spring morning, some 10 years after Odoacer's rise, Cassian was sitting in the scriptorium, carefully examining a newly completed transcription of Vitruvius's De Architectura, its intricate diagrams meticulously reproduced by a talented young monk named Benedictus. Brother Valerius, his own hair now as white as Cassian's, but his eyes still holding their calm, steady light, entered the room. A visitor, Cassian, the abbot announced, a rare note of excitement in his usually placid voice. A scholar from Constantinople. He has heard of our work, of our collection of classical texts. He brings greetings from the Patriarch, and, it is said, a request from the Imperial Library itself. Cassian's heart gave a sudden, unexpected leap. Constantinople. The great city on the Bosphorus, the new Rome, the capital of the still flourishing Eastern Empire. For so long, it had seemed a world away, a distant, almost mythical realm. That they, in their humble Italian scriptorium, should have attracted the attention of scholars from that great center of learning. It was a validation, beyond anything he had dared to hope for. The visitor, a man named Theophilus, was a deacon of the Hagia Sophia, a scholar of considerable erudition, his Greek as polished as the mosaics in the great palace. He spent several days at St. Stephen's, examining their collection with a keen, appreciative eye. He was particularly impressed by Cassian's Latin translation of Marcus Aurelius and by the rare Arian commentaries on Epictetus. These are treasures, Dominus Cassian, Magister Valerius, Theophilus declared on the eve of his departure, his voice filled with genuine admiration. Many such texts, we fear, have been lost in the West during these troubled times. The Emperor Zeno himself, and his successor Anastasius, are keen patrons of learning. There is a great effort underway in Constantinople to gather and preserve the complete heritage of both Greek and Roman wisdom. The Imperial Library would be deeply honored to receive copies of these particular works, to ensure their survival for all posterity, under the protection of the Roman eagle that still flies proudly in the East. He then produced, from a heavily guarded chest, a gift for the monastery, a magnificent, illuminated codex of the Gospels in Greek, its cover adorned with ivory and garnets. And, even more precious to Cassian and Valerius, a generous supply of the finest Egyptian papyrus and several pots of vibrant, costly inks, purple, crimson, and gold. That evening, after Theophilus had retired, Cassian and Valerius sat together in the quiet scriptorium, the Constantinopolitan Gospel Codex open on the table between them, its intricate illuminations gleaming in the lamplight. So, Valerius said softly, a gentle smile playing on his lips, our little stream of rescued knowledge now flows back towards the great river of the East. It seems the seeds you planted in such sorrow, Cassian, have borne fruit beyond our imagining. Cassian looked at the faces of his fellow monks, bent over their work with quiet dedication. He saw young Marcus, no longer a boy but a man, now himself a skilled teacher, patiently guiding the hand of a new novice. He saw Benedictus, meticulously adding the final decorative flourishes to his Vitruvius. He thought of the journey these texts had taken, from the great libraries of a triumphant Rome. Through the chaos of its fall, to this small, peaceful sanctuary, and now, perhaps, to a new life, a new audience, in the glittering capital of the surviving empire. The cycle of history, he reflected, was not merely one of rise and fall, of triumph and decay. It was also a cycle of preservation and renewal, of loss and rediscovery. The forms of empire might crumble, the legions might vanish, the marble monuments might turn to dust. But the ideas, the wisdom, the quenchless human thirst for understanding and beauty, these, if carefully tended, could endure. They could cross borders, bridge centuries, and speak with undiminished power to new generations, in new languages, in new worlds. He picked up a freshly cut quill, dipped it into the rich, dark ink Livia had brought them so long ago, a gift that now seemed like a relic from another lifetime. He turned to a clean sheet of parchment. There was still so much to do, so many voices yet to be heard, so many fragile embers to be fanned back into flame. The work, he knew, would never truly be finished, but in that very continuity, in that endless, hopeful task of preservation and transmission, lay its profound and enduring meaning. And for Cassian Ambrosius Magnus, that was more than enough. It was everything.